Every cadet who has ever run the Kesh drill has done exactly one of three things. They have screamed. They have frozen so completely that the simulation had to be shut down around them, their hearts still hammering an hour later. Or, in 11 recorded cases across 400 years, they have simply stopped breathing and the medics have had to remind their bodies how. We do not run this drill to be cruel. We run it because the assembly learned at great cost early in its history that the first time a young officer meets something truly unbeatable should never be the first time they've thought about what that feels like. Better to break in a simulation chamber under observation with medics standing by than to break for the first time on a real bridge, with real lives depending on whatever they do next. The human did none of these things. The human finished the drill, looked at the readout, and asked the instructor what was next. I am Vex Thirkolin, third-tier evaluation officer of the Unified Cadet Academy, and I have been grading fear for 131 cycles. I want you to understand that number, because it means I have seen fear in every shape it comes in. The noble kind, the useful kind, the kind that keeps a species alive long enough to build starships. I thought I had cataloged every version of it that walked on 2 legs, 4 legs, or none at all. Then I met a species with almost no claws, no venom, no armor, one heart doing the work that most of my students split across 2 or 3, and skin so soft you could bruise it with a hard stare. And that species walked into the worst thing my academy has ever built for the sole purpose of terrifying young officers, and treated it like a mildly interesting Tuesday. This is the story of how that happened, and why, 131 cycles into my career, I finally had to rewrite my lecture notes. The Unified Cadet Academy sits in synchronous orbit above Threna Prime, a station shaped like a slow-spinning wheel, so that every corridor has a little gravity, and every cadet has somewhere to be sick if they need to. We are, officially, a joint training institution for the 11 founding species of the Unified Assembly. Unofficially, we are a very expensive machine for finding out which cadets will get their squad mates killed before they find out in combat instead. My job title is Evaluation Officer, which is a polite way of saying I am paid to watch people almost die in carefully controlled ways and then write a report about it. In 131 cycles, I have written 11,412 of those reports. I know this number exactly because on slow shifts I count them instead of sleeping, which my physician tells me is a concerning coping mechanism, and which I tell her is Tuesday. The academy itself is a monument to a very old, very reasonable premise, that the universe does not care how advanced your species has become, and the day it decides to remind you of that, you had better already know what you're going to do about it. We do not train cadets to win every engagement. We train them to know, in the half-second before their instincts take over, which of the 3 responses their body is about to choose without asking permission. Fight, flight, freeze. Every species that has ever sat in our lecture halls has, at some point, had an instructor draw a triangle on the board with those 3 words at the corners and say, "This is the whole of you, cadet, in a crisis." Everything else is decoration. It is, I will admit, a slightly grim thing to teach 18-cycle-old recruits on their first week away from home. But grim has kept the Assembly's member species alive for longer than optimism ever managed to on its own, and the Academy has never much cared about being liked. Every species that joins the Assembly brings its own instincts to this station, forged over however many 100 million years its planet spent trying to eat it. My own people, the Thirkolin, come from a world with 3 suns and no shade, which is why we have 4 eyes and the emotional temperament of something that spent its whole evolutionary history checking over its shoulder. It is a running joke among the other instructors that you can tell a Thirkolon has entered a room because the room gets quieter and everyone stands up a little straighter, whether or not we outrank them. We didn't survive our sun by being relaxed about things. The Academy's crown jewel, or its curse, depending which cadet you ask, is a training exercise we call the Kesh drill, named after Commandant Kesh Oldramir, who built it 300 years ago and reportedly never smiled again afterward. The drill simulates something we have never actually shown any student in full, a Class O predator incursion. Not a battle, not a siege. A predator apex, unbeatable by any conventional metric, appearing without warning in an enclosed space with the cadet inside it. The rules of the universe, as every cadet is taught before they ever set foot in that simulation chamber, are simple and absolute. No species outruns a Class Yo predator. No species outfights one. The only variable the Academy has ever been able to measure is how a sapient mind behaves in the seconds before it understands it cannot win. That is what the drill tests. Not survival. Nobody survives the drill. Not really, because the simulation is built to be unsurvivable. It tests what you do with the time you have left. In 300 years, no cadet has ever finished the Kesh drill comm. Most don't finish it at all. The record for cadet who performed best under the Kesh drill belonged, until 6 months ago, to a Varanthi war priest named Dosk Amaran, who managed to compose herself enough to recite a death prayer before the simulated creature reached her. We hold her recording up as the gold standard. We show it to nervous first years and say, "This is what grace under pressure looks like. I want you to remember Dosk's prayer." It matters later, mostly because of how thoroughly the humans made it look, by comparison, like someone politely excusing themselves from a party they hadn't wanted to attend in the first place. Before I tell you about the humans, you should meet the rest of my evaluation cohort for that cycle, because their reactions are the measuring stick against which everything the humans did will make sense. You cannot appreciate a silence until you have heard the room it's supposed to be filling. Cadet Breen Al-Yosh of the Skarathi joined the Academy from a homeworld I can only describe as, if the ocean decided to have opinions. The Skarathi evolved in the deep trench systems of Skyrath, where the only successful survival strategy against the things that live below the photic zone is to be somewhere else. Immediately, permanently, and without discussion. Breenal has gill slits along her jaw that flare when she's nervous, and by the time she'd read the drill briefing twice, they hadn't stopped flaring since. Her tell is that she counts exits, in every room, out loud, under her breath, whether or not she needs them. I have heard her do it in the cafeteria. Cadet Torv Bahnuset, a Garathi, comes from a plains world where his species survived by being the third fastest thing in any given herd, fast enough to not be last, never foolish enough to think they could be first. Garathi have 4 legs and a low center of gravity built entirely around one evolutionary imperative, which is, do not stop moving. Torv's pet peeve, which he will tell you about whether you ask or not, is doors that don't open fast enough. He has genuinely written a complaint to station maintenance about door latency. Twice. Cadet Ayen Korvasa, an Ashenvale, was the closest thing my cohort had to a predator herself. Her people evolved as apex hunters on a world with brutal seasonal extinctions, meaning Ashenvale don't panic easily, they calculate. Ayen is our tactical mind, the one who runs probability trees before breakfast out of habit. Her nervous tell, if you know her well enough to see it, is that she goes quiet, not frightened. Quiet, calculating quiet, which her instructors have learned to actually find more unsettling than screaming. And Cadet Osenthrai of the Mulven rounded out my usual cohort that cycle. A species built low and armored, evolved on a world where the ground itself occasionally tried to swallow you, all sinkholes and shifting crust, which is why Mulven walk with a peculiar rolling gait, testing weight before committing to a step, even on a station floor that has never once given way beneath anyone. Osun's tell is that he apologizes, constantly, reflexively, to furniture he bumps into, to instructors who haven't asked him a question yet, to the drill itself before he's even entered the chamber, as though sufficient politeness might convince the universe to go easier on him. It never has. He does it anyway. 4 species, 4 homeworlds, 4 entirely different sets of teeth the universe had used to shape them, and every one of those teeth had left the same basic imprint. A nervous system tuned, generation after generation, to treat the unbeatable thing as a problem to be avoided, outrun, or endured until it passed. That is not a flaw in any of them. That is the whole reason any of them are alive to attend my academy at all. And then there was the human contingent, whose homeworld, as far as I can tell from 6 months of increasingly bewildered research, tried to kill them with roughly everything simultaneously and somehow produced a species that treats most of it as background noise. There were 4 of them that cycle: Priya Okonkwo Lindqvist, Dave Marsh, Thomas Reyes, and a woman everyone just called Coop, because apparently getting her actual surname right required more syllables than the average human was willing to commit to before their morning caffeine ritual. I want to be clear that these are their actual names, as recorded, unedited, undignified by any attempt to make them sound impressive. Humans, I have since learned, simply do not do that to each other. There is no Ashkar the Undying among them, there is a Dave. I remember looking over their physiological files before the drill and, I will admit, feeling something close to pity. No claws, no venom glands, no chromatophores, no exoskeleton, no secondary heart, no bioluminescence, no retractable anything. One heart, doing double duty for a body that runs disturbingly hot and bruises if you look at it sternly. Their most notable defensive adaptation, according to the file, was, can produce tears when upset, which as combat features go rank somewhere below smells nice sometimes. I remember thinking, whatever instinct kept this species alive long enough to build starships, it was clearly not a physical one. I assumed it was cleverness, tools, cooperation, the usual explanations we give for soft-bodied species that somehow didn't die out in the first 10,000 years. I did not yet understand that the thing keeping humans alive was not a trick they'd invented. It was something older and stranger than that. And I would spend the next several hours watching it in real time without recognizing it for what it was. They arrived to their briefing 5 minutes late, which is itself a minor scandal at the academy. Their cadets arrive early enough to count exits before the instructor does, and Skarathi arrive early because arriving late means standing near a closed door, which no Skarathi will do voluntarily. The humans arrived at a jog, mildly out of breath, arguing about whether the transit tram on Deck 9 actually runs on the schedule posted or on a schedule only it knows about. Nobody apologized for the delay. Nobody seemed to think an apology was owed. Asen, standing near the door, apologized on their behalf out of what I can only assume was pure reflex. I read the physiological brief while they settled. No claws, no venom, no chromatophores, no exoskeleton. One heart where most of my students carry 2 or 3 as a redundancy against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Skin thin enough to bruise from a firm handshake by Thercolin standards. A species that, on paper, should not have survived its own nursery predators, let alone built the ships that brought its 4 representatives to my academy. The first thing Dave Marsh said upon being told he would be facing an unbeatable simulated predator alone in an enclosed chamber was, and I am reading this directly from the recording, "Cool. Is there a snack machine on the way?" I did not laugh. Thercolin rarely do out loud. But something in my chest did the internal equivalent, and I made a note in the margin of my evaluation form that I would later be forced to revise substantially. The drill briefing room has a viewing gallery, which is where the rest of the cohort watches whoever's turn it is. I have run this drill enough times to know exactly how a viewing gallery is supposed to sound, and I want you to hold that sound in your mind, because the contrast is the entire point of this story. Breenal's gill slits started flaring the moment the simulation clock began counting down, and she began, under her breath, counting the exits in the viewing gallery itself, though nobody in the gallery was in any danger at all. Torv's boots, though he insists on describing them as hooves, had started tapping an anxious 4-beat rhythm against the floor plating before the first minute was through. Yen had gone silent in the specific way that meant she was running combat trees in her head for a fight she wasn't even in. Her eyes tracking angles on the display like she was the one about to be dropped into that chamber. Our resident tactical officer for that session, an Ashenvale instructor named Karshol Ven, who has run probability models on this drill for longer than most of my cadets have been alive, stated the numbers for the room the way he always does, cold and precise, because that precision is meant to be reassuring. It never is. Victory probability against class a threat class, unaided, single combatant, 0.1%, Karsh said. Survival past 90 seconds without extraction, 2.4%. These creatures do not retreat once engaged. There is no negotiated outcome. He said this while Priya Okonkwo Lindqvist stood in the observation queue behind Dave, checking something on her wrist unit that I would later learn was, in fact, a watch, and that she was checking it not out of nerves, but because she'd made a bet with Tomas about how long Dave's turn would take. 10 credit says he's out in under 4 minutes, she said. He's going to talk to it, Tomas said. He talks to everything. He talked to a vending machine for 10 minutes last week because it ate his money. That's not a bet against 4 minutes. It's a bet against sanity, Priya. I remember staring at the two of them, then back at the readout counting down to Dave's simulation start, and feeling a specific, unfamiliar vertigo, the sense that I was watching two entirely different events happen in the same room. One event was a Class O incursion drill, statistically almost unsurvivable, about to claim its 400-and-something recorded failure. The other event was two friends placing a small bet about snack timing. Karsh's voice cracked very slightly on the word engaged, the only tell he gave that even his calm was calibrated for an audience that was, on some fundamental level, supposed to be afraid. The humans were not afraid. And the terrible thing, the thing that made my 4 eyes strain against each other trying to make sense of it, is that they weren't pretending not to be afraid, the way a soldier steadies themselves before a mission. There was no steadying happening. There was nothing to steady. It was like watching someone calmly discuss lunch options while a hurricane made landfall 2 buildings over. Except the hurricane was, allegedly, the deadliest thing my species has ever engineered a simulation to depict. Austin, standing near the humans, had started apologizing to Dave preemptively, for reasons even he did not seem entirely able to articulate. "Sorry," he said, Sorry, I just don't understand how you're not." And he didn't finish the sentence, because there wasn't a word in assembly standard for what he was trying to ask. And there wasn't one in his own language either, which I know, because I checked afterward. Brinal had stopped counting exits and started instead, quietly reciting the names of every Skarathi who had ever run this drill and survived it. A tradition among her people, invoking the ones who came before, as though borrowed courage might be transferable if you asked politely enough. Torv's tapping had climbed from 4 beats to 6, then stopped altogether, which for a Garathi is worse than any amount of tapping, because stillness in a species built entirely around motion means the body has finally run out of anywhere to put the fear. The simulation chamber's ambient lighting dimmed to combat amber. The visual cue every cadet has been conditioned, across 411 prior runs, to associate with the specific flavor of dread that precedes the Kesh construct's arrival. I watched every alien face in that gallery tighten in near unison, an old, deep species-spanning recognition. This is the part where it gets bad. Dave Marsh checked the time on his wrist unit, saw it wasn't his, and handed it back to Priya without comment. The countdown reached 0. The chamber doors sealed. The lights inside dropped to the low amber the simulation uses to mimic failing emergency power, and on the gallery display, the Class O construct materialized behind Dave Marsh. 6 meters of simulated muscle, teeth built from a predator template that our xenobiology department assembled from the worst features of 9 different apex hunters, because nothing in nature was quite bad enough on its own. I have watched 411 cadets face this moment. I know the shape fear takes in that half second before the mind understands what it's looking at. Brinal's gills beside me had stopped flaring entirely and gone rigid, which for a Skarathi is worse. Torv's front leg had locked mid-step. Even Ien, calculating, imperturbable Ien, had gone very still in a way that read less like composure and more like held breath. Dave Marsh turned around. He did not scream. He did not freeze in the way the drill measures freezing, the kind where the limbic system seizes the body and refuses to release it, the kind we score on a scale specifically because it happens to everyone eventually, given enough teeth. He looked at the construct and his shoulders dropped. Actually dropped. The posture of a man who has just been told a meeting he was dreading got rescheduled to next week. "Huh," he said. "Okay." The construct lunged. Every simulation timer in the gallery spiked. Karsh's tactical overlay flared red across 6 separate probability trees simultaneously, the kind of cascading failure state the system throws when reality stops behaving the way the math insists it should. Dave didn't run. He didn't fight, not in any sense our combat drills would recognize. No defensive stance, no attempt at a weapon. Nothing our records have a box to check for. He simply stood his ground, hands loose at his sides, and watched the thing come at him the way you'd watch weather roll in that you already knew you couldn't avoid. "So, what happens after this part?" he said, to no one, to the chamber, to the thing about to reach him. "Is there a debrief? Or?" The construct's head lowered, a slow predatory arc, the kind of motion our xenobiology department modeled specifically to trigger the deepest, oldest layer of prey recognition in every species we've ever tested it on. The layer beneath language, beneath training, beneath rank insignia and cadet oaths. I have watched that motion break 411 cadets in 411 different ways. I watched it reach Dave Marsh, and watched his shoulders stay exactly where they'd dropped to a minute earlier. "You know," he said conversationally, to a 6-meter engineered nightmare that was, by every metric my academy has ever built, incapable of being spoken to, "you've got a lot of teeth for something that's just going to disappear in a second anyway." The construct did not disappear. The construct advanced. In the gallery, I heard Brinal's recitation falter mid-name, heard Torv's held stillness finally break into a single sharp intake of breath, heard Yenna's quiet, calculating go, for the first time in the whole session, audibly uncertain, a small, involuntary "that's not," that she didn't finish either. The construct's jaws closed the distance. The simulation, per protocol, terminates contact just short of full resolution to avoid trauma to the cadet. A half-second freeze frame the system holds before ending the exercise, specifically so instructors can capture the cadet's final expression for the report. Dave's final expression, frozen on every display in that gallery, was mild curiosity. Not defiance, not terror, not the grim, prayerful stillness Dosk Amarin had given us 6 months prior. The recording we'd held up as the gold standard of grace under pressure. Dave Marsh looked at the worst thing my academy could build, in the last half-second before simulated death, like a man waiting to see what happens next in a show he wasn't sure he liked yet. Karshulven's voice, when it came, was not the cold, tactical recitation he'd opened with. It came out smaller. That's not a freeze response," he said. "That's not fight, that's not flight." He looked at the readout again as though it might correct itself. "I don't have a category for that." The simulation ended. The lights came back up to normal, and Dave Marsh, entirely unbothered, turned to the observation window, found Priya, and gave her a thumbs up. 4 minutes 20, he called. "You lose." "That's not..." "The bet wasn't the point, Dave. I did not write a normal evaluation that shift. I sat in front of my terminal for 11 minutes with the cursor blinking on an empty field before I managed a single sentence. I requested Dave Marsh for a formal debrief within the hour, and I will admit, 131 cycles of evaluations, and I still walked into that room unsettled in a way I hadn't been since my own cadet years. I had 411 data points telling me what a mind does when it understands it's about to die. Dave had just handed me a 412th that broke the axis the other 411 were plotted on. "Cadet Marsh," I said, "I need you to explain your response in the drill." He shrugged, which I have learned is a human gesture meaning several different things depending on context, none of which I could yet reliably decode. "Not much to explain. Thing was gonna get me either way, right? Numbers said 0.1%. I'm not great at math, but that sounded like a no. So you accepted your death. I mean..." He considered this genuinely the way you'd consider a question about which route to take home. "I guess. But it's a sim, so not really my death. And even if it wasn't, yeah. If something's definitely gonna happen and there's nothing you can do about it, being scared doesn't change the outcome. It just makes the part before the outcome worse. So what's the point?" I sat with that for longer than was professionally appropriate. "Every species in this assembly," I said, "is built by evolution to fight, to flee, or to freeze in the face of an unbeatable threat. This is not a flaw. It is what kept your ancestors, and mine, alive long enough to matter. What you did in that chamber does not correspond to any of the three." Dave scratched the back of his neck and for the first time in the conversation looked slightly embarrassed, though not, I sensed, for the reason I expected. "Honestly, I think we've got all three. Humans freeze all the time. You should see me at a job interview." We run, definitely, ask literally any predator that used to live near us. And we fight, obviously. We're not exactly known for being chill about stuff. He paused. I think we've just also got a fourth one nobody talks about as much. We get bored of being scared. Like fear's expensive. Costs a lot to keep the engine running that hot. At some point, your body just goes, okay, we've established this is bad. Can we downshift now and just deal with it? That is not an evolutionary strategy, I said. That is exhaustion. Sure, he said. But exhaustion that shows up on a schedule turns into a strategy eventually, doesn't it? If the scary thing's still coming either way. I did not have a rebuttal. I had 11,412 reports behind me and not one line in any of them that addressed a species whose relationship with terror was, apparently, to simply run out the clock on it. You said the construct had a lot of teeth, I said. For your own species and a species with none, was that not in itself alarming? Dave considered this properly for the first time since he'd sat down. The way you'd consider a question somebody had actually thought about beforehand, instead of the small talk we'd been trading. I think alarming and dangerous aren't the same thing from where I'm standing, like, sharks have a lot of teeth. Most people never get near one and it never comes up. Storms don't have teeth at all, and they've probably killed more of us than every predator on Earth combined. You learn pretty quick that scary looking and actually a threat only overlap sometimes. So when I saw the teeth, honestly, I mostly thought, that's a design choice. Somebody committed to that. Wasn't really thinking about my own. He paused. I guess that's probably not the answer you were hoping for. I did not have a hope going in, I admitted. I had a rubric. You have made the rubric considerably harder to fill out. He grinned at that, unbothered, the first sign in the whole conversation that he found any part of this genuinely funny, rather than merely unremarkable. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry about... He was, notably, the second human that day to apologize to me for something that was not, by any reasonable measure, his fault. I began to suspect it was less a personality trait of Dave Marsh, specifically, and more something the whole species does when it senses it has inconvenienced someone's carefully constructed sense of how the universe is supposed to behave. I would like to say Dave Marsh was an outlier. My 131 cycles of experience desperately wanted him to be an outlier, because outliers are easy. You write them up, you flag them for follow-on study, you file the report, and move on with your understanding of the universe intact. Instead, over the following 3 drills, the humans handed me 3 more data points, each one a little more absurd than the last, until outlier stopped being a defensible word. Thomas Reyes went next. He did not stand still like Dave. He actually approached the construct which the drill has never in 300 years recorded a cadet doing voluntarily. Karsh's overlay flagged the movement instantly, a bright warning glyph that had never in its operational history needed to mean cadet is walking toward class a threat, unprompted, unarmed. When Karsh asked him afterward why, Tomas said with total sincerity, "If it's gonna get me either way, I wanted a better look at it. It's kind of a cool design, honestly. Somebody put real work into those teeth." I noted quietly that Karsh's tactical overlay had thrown a second cascading failure state, because approaching the threat out of aesthetic curiosity was not a behavior any of our combat models had ever needed to account for. Brinal, watching from the gallery, made a sound I had genuinely never heard a Skarathi make before. Not fear, not disgust, something closer to a scandalized laugh. The specific noise of a species that spent its entire evolutionary history convinced that curiosity near a predator was how you got removed from the gene pool. Watching someone do exactly that and simply walk away afterward. "He's going to get us all fired," Brinal said, to nobody in particular, which was not accurate. Nobody's employment was at risk, but which I understood by then was less a statement of fact and more the sound a nervous system makes when it has run entirely out of established categories to file something under. Coop's turn was, if possible, stranger. 20 seconds into her simulation, with the construct bearing down on her, she started humming. Not a battle hymn, not a death prayer in the tradition of Dosk Amaran, an actual tune, low and off-key, that she later identified as a song about a truck. Osun, watching, apologized to the construct itself, quietly, as though it too deserved sympathy for being so thoroughly ignored by the thing it was supposed to be terrorizing. When I asked Coop why she'd hummed, she looked at me like I'd asked why she breathes. "Helps me think," she said. And there wasn't really anything left to think about, so I figured I'd just enjoy the last 20 seconds of quiet. It's actually pretty peaceful in there once you stop trying to fight it. Torv, who had by then watched 3 humans face the same unwinnable scenario in 3 visibly different, equally untroubled ways, asked her the question I suspect every alien cadet in that gallery was quietly forming by then. "Were you not afraid? Even a little? Even at the start?" Coop thought about it honestly, which I noticed by then was a habit all 4 of them shared. None of them answered fear questions glibly, whatever their answers turned out to be. "Yeah, for like the first 2 seconds. Same as anybody. Then the 2 seconds were up and there wasn't a third one where being scared was going to do anything useful, so I just stopped renewing the subscription, I guess." But it was Priya Okonkwo Lindqvist, last of the 4, who gave me the line I would end up repeating to every instructor on this station, the one that finally reorganized 131 cycles of assumptions into something like a coherent shape. She did not freeze. She did not approach out of curiosity. She did not hum. She stood exactly where Dave had stood, watched the same 6-meter horror close the same impossible distance, and when the simulation held its half-second freeze frame before ending, her expression was not fear, and it was not calm exactly. It was something closer to patience. Afterward, when I asked her, genuinely asked, no longer performing the evaluation officer's clinical distance because I no longer had any distance left to perform with, she said, "Everything on our world is trying to kill you or it's not. Weather, animals, diseases, other people on a bad day. Panic doesn't help with either kind. If it's the kind that's trying to kill you, panicking just makes you slower and dumber right when you need to be fast and smart. And if it's the kind that isn't, well then panicking was just a waste of a good afternoon." I wrote that sentence down word for word. I have it pinned above my desk now. I should note, for the sake of thoroughness and because I think it matters more than the line itself, that Priya's hands were not steady when she said it. I watched them, out of habit, the way I watch every cadet's hands during a debrief, because hands rarely lie the way voices can be trained to. Hers had a faint, persistent tremor, the kind my own species gets after a threat has passed and the body finally permits itself to acknowledge what it just survived. She was not lying about the philosophy. She simply hadn't been lying about the fear either. She had only ever intended to let it in for as long as it was useful, and not 1 second longer. The academy does not change quickly. 300 years of institutional weight does not bend for 4 cadets in a single training cycle, whatever their evaluation officer's personal astonishment. But small things shifted in the weeks that followed, the kind of shifts you only notice if you're the one standing close enough to see them. The viewing gallery seating chart changed first unofficially, the way these things always do, not by decree, just by cadets quietly choosing where to sit. Within 2 cycles, the seats nearest the human cadets' usual spots had become the most sought after in the gallery. Cadets started angling to watch the drill from wherever Priya or Thomas happened to be standing, because, and I heard this phrased almost identically by 3 separate cadets from 3 separate species, it's easier to watch if you're near someone who isn't scared. Karsholven rewrote his tactical briefing. Where he had once opened every drill session with cold percentages, meant to sharpen focus through dread, he began instead, quietly, almost sheepishly, the first time, with a line borrowed, without much disguise, from Priya. Ask yourself which kind of scary this is before you decide how scared to be. He has used some version of that line in every briefing since. He has not, to my knowledge, told her he took it. And the Academy added a line to the official Kesh drill assessment rubric 6 months after that cycle, a category that did not exist in 300 years of the drill's history. Composure classification, anomalous. I am told, unofficially, that the instructors who wrote it argued for over a week about what to call it before settling on that phrase, because none of the existing vocabulary for fear responses had room for what 4 cadets from one small, Soft-skinned, single-hearted species had shown an evaluation officer with 4 eyes and 131 cycles of supposedly settled expertise. Austin stopped apologizing to the drill chamber too. Not entirely, apology being rather load-bearing to Mulvan identity, but he stopped apologizing to it before entering, which his own instructors flagged as the single largest behavioral shift they'd recorded in his file all cycle. When I asked him about it, he shrugged, a gesture he'd clearly picked up from watching the humans, and said, "Didn't seem like the thing minded either way, honestly. Figured I'd save it for something that does." And Breenel, whose gills had flared at every closed door on this station for 3 cycles running, requested, quietly, almost embarrassed to ask, that she be assigned to observe Dave's next drill session specifically, rather than anyone else's. When her instructor asked why, she gave an answer that has since made its way, in one form or another, into 2 other cadets' files. "I don't think I'll ever do the thing he does, but it's easier to remember I can survive being scared when I'm standing next to someone who's already decided it's not going to run the show. I have spent 131 cycles grading fear, and I believed until 6 months ago that I understood its shape completely. That fear is simply the price every sapient mind pays for the privilege of surviving in a universe built mostly out of things that would like to eat it. I believed that price was fixed. I believed every species paid it the same way, in one of 3 currencies: fight, flight, or the terrible stillness of freeze. What I did not understand, and what I am only now beginning to, is that humans did not find a 4th currency. They found something closer to a discount, not because they feel less. I have watched Priya's hands shake after a drill she claimed not to be afraid of, watched Dave go quiet for an hour after Tomas's turn in a way no amount of snack machine jokes could quite cover. They feel everything the rest of us feel. They simply refuse to let the feeling drive, once it's finished doing whatever useful work it came to do. It is not bravery, not exactly, though it looks like bravery from the outside, the way a candle looks like the sun, if you've never seen the sun. It is not recklessness, either, whatever Karsh's ruined probability trees might have implied about the species that broke them. It is something stranger and I think harder won, a species that grew up on a world so relentlessly, indiscriminately dangerous, weather and beasts and each other, in no particular order, on no particular schedule, that they eventually stopped asking whether a thing could be survived and started only asking what to do with the time until they found out. I have thought a great deal these past 6 months about Dos Cameron's death prayer, the recording we held up for 300 years as the ceiling of what composure under the Kesh drill could look like. I do not think humans have raised that ceiling exactly. I think they have shown me that the ceiling was never where I thought it was, because I had been measuring the wrong thing all along. Dosk's prayer was composure achieved despite fear, a mind holding its shape against the full weight of what it understood was coming. What Dave, Thomas, Coop, and Priya showed me was something adjacent, but not identical. Not the absence of fear, and not fear overcome by will alone, but fear that had simply, at some point in a very long and very dangerous evolutionary history, learned its own expiration date and honored it. I do not know if this makes humans stronger than the rest of us. I suspect it does not in any way my old evaluation rubrics were built to measure. What I know is that it makes them very difficult to frighten in the way my academy has spent 300 years perfecting, and I have come against 131 cycles of professional instinct to find something almost comforting in that. There is a particular kind of relief in standing next to someone who has already decided the worst thing in the room does not get to decide how they spend the next 4 minutes. I have 4 eyes, and for 131 cycles I believed that gave me a wider view of fear than most species in this assembly could claim. I am no longer certain that was ever true. I think perhaps I simply had more surface area to watch it happen on. It took 4 soft-skinned, single-hearted cadets with unremarkable names and a bet about snack machines to show me that watching fear closely and understanding it are not, in fact, the same skill, and that I had spent a career mistaking one for the other. Dave Marsh, for what it's worth, still asks me every time he passes my office whether I've settled on a category for what he did that day. I have not. I am beginning to suspect I never will, and that this too is the point. That some things a species does, are not meant to fit cleanly into anyone else's rubric, and the honest thing to do with them is not to file them away, but to sit with the not knowing a while longer. The drill was not built to be survived. In 300 years, it never has been. It was, however, apparently built to be waited out. Patiently, a little curiously, humming an off-key song about a truck, right up until someone finally thought to ask what came next. If this one hit, there's more where it came from. See you in the next one. Hit the subscribe.